Hello, everyone. I'm Svend Rønning, Artistic Director of the Second City Chamber Series in Tacoma, Washington, welcoming you back to some online music and conversations with some of the many interesting people we feature as Second City Chamber Series artists. In this installment, I'm speaking with the indefatigable Lisa Bergman, pianist, radio, DJ, entrepreneur, comedian, fellow Scandinavian, and all-around fabulous person. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Sven. That was a lovely introduction. Actually, indefatigable really is a polite way of saying I don't know when to say no. I'm greedy. That's the point.
You're industrious. I think it's fantastic. And speaking of industrious, I think you probably hold or nearly hold the world record as the single human to have played the most Second City Chamber Series concerts in our 43-year history. Probably Jerry Crockett maybe has a slight lead over you, but I don't think that anyone else has. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved with Second City Chamber Series so many years ago, and tell us about some of the highlights of performing down here?
Well, thank you for that opportunity, and I'm flattered and honored to hold that title of the frequent performer medal. But really, the beginning was so unusual. Jerry Crockett was new in the role of artistic director, and he was getting his feelers out for regional musicians, and he invited me to be on my first go with the series. This would have been, I'm going to say, in 1986 or 87, a long time ago.
Right.
And there was kind of a premium on rehearsal space, and we were working with a singer who lived down in Federal Way, and so long story short, the best arrangement was to meet at her house. And that seemed like an easy thing, and it was fun, and we all showed up, and she said, well, let's have a cup of tea and then let's go give it a shot. And she said, I just need to warn you that my piano is upstairs. And we thought, okay. So we went upstairs. Well, the piano was in her bedroom. So that became Jerry's and my party line, is that when we first met, it was in the bedroom. and he had to sit on the bed with his clarinet, and the piano was this little spinet against the wall, and she stood up and all that. It was just hilarious. So from the bedroom scene, I moved to one of the highlights of the whole experience over 20 years of concerts. And this has to do with the insatiability of audiences for experience. And we were playing a piece by Toru Takemitsu, and it was published actually the music was published in a round shape, and you had to kind of turn it like this when you played it. It was one of his experimental techniques. Yeah. And we, of course, described that in great detail to the audience before we began to play. And then they saw for themselves how we had to negotiate this chart. Well, we came to the end of the piece, which was really quite exciting. And the audience jumped to its feet, clapped their hands off, and stormed the stage. They like came in this herd, and they were all over the stage and looking at the music, and we had to almost blow a policeman's whistle to get a control on this crowd. And it was a very exciting moment because you could see how they had been drawn in, not just audibly, but visually. I would say that's a highlight of one of my highlights in my whole career.
Interesting. And how did you just like spin? I just tried to think about, the only score I'm familiar with not like that offhand is one that J.S. Bach drew for Frederick the Great in his musical offering, right? That he did, yeah. He graphically represented what he was doing. And I can't imagine actually reading the music off of that. So how did you do that?
Well, the music was sort of in little vectors. And so every time you turned it, you were still seeing top to bottom. and then you just turned it. And I had cut the outside with little straight pieces so that it wouldn't roll.
Right. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Okay.
great fun.
So Takemitsu didn't really totally think that through. That had to be on you.
Yeah, engineered. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Interesting. Wow. I know. Honestly, you have had an incredibly interesting career doing so many different things, and I think one of the reasons that it's so interesting, Lisa, is that you just have a lot of imagination, and you know how to create fun out of every circumstance that you're in.
Well, thank
But
you. It takes two to tango on that, though, I gotta tell you.
well, I mean, we all do this for the joy of doing it, of course.
Yeah.
But in addition to being the pianist and accompanist, you, like me, you've been artistic director of a chamber series. In your case, mostly Nordic chamber series, as well as the Meadow Valley Chamber Music Festival, Meadow Music Festival. You've been executive director of Noise, Northwest Opera in Schools, etc., and the Icicle Creek Music Center in Leavenworth. And you've been a radio announcer on King FM for many years as well. How did you develop all of these ancillary interests?
Well, years ago, I recognized the beauty in keeping one's options open. In other words, yes, I was trained as a classical pianist in every sense of the word and have a lot of degrees to prove it, but somehow hovering around, maybe sitting on my shoulder, was my dad's advice. Just always said, never say no until you know the whole story. And I followed that advice and used it to what I used to call expand my empire or build my empire. And that meant necessarily stepping outside of that narrow window of the world of the classical performing pianist. The first step was becoming totally involved in chamber music and accompanying. Beyond that, things started to kind of come my way. So to answer your question, Sven, really the way I developed all these ancillary interests was because I saw a need and I saw how I could fill that role. For example, this would have been in 1988. We bought our first computer, and on it was a tutorial for Works, which was the Microsoft program that came before Excel. And I learned how to build a spreadsheet. Now, that's not something I learned at the Juilliard School, I can assure you. But it paved the way for an administrative leadership role in many organizations, even as an artistic director, because I know enough about how budgets work to keep my eye on the executive director. So that's how it started. And I've never gone wrong by that. There have been endless opportunities knocking on my door. So that's where learning to say no has been something I had to do, because there's no end to opportunity if you've got your eye open for it.
Right. Of course, the thing that people know you for maybe the most now is being a radio DJ at Classic King FM, of course, because your reach extends far farther than it could as a pianist in a concert hall, or indeed as a muck-to-muck in a music festival somewhere, right? That
Right.
Here you're really broadcasting to the entire Pugitopolis. So can you tell us about how that came to be?
Sure. And part of that work really does parlay everything else that I represent as a trained musician and an administrator and a music historian to a degree. All those things really do make possible my work on the radio. And it all started with Harriet Bullitt, who had, in the year 2000, purchased an FM station in Leavenworth, where her Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort and the Icicle Creek Center for the Arts got their beginnings. And as such, as the owner of this FM station, she was in control of what would be broadcast on it, and she was determined that there would be some classical music. So we called it the Green Room, and she invited me to be a radio host. And I said to Harriet, sorry, this is one of the few times I said, nah, I'm a pianist. I don't know diddly about being on the radio. And she said, be yourself, because the listening audience can tell a phony a mile away, but you just be yourself. So I went behind her back and I took some coaching from a pro. And I learned the basics, like no dairy or chocolate before you go on the air. And that's because it produces all sorts of congestion and phlegm and whatnot. So you need to avoid things like that. No popcorn because it gets stuck in your teeth, makes you cough, and so on. But I also learned a valuable lesson, which was never, ever correct yourself on the air. And you know who's an expert at this, who are experts at this, are weather people. You never hear a weatherman say, or weather lady say, well, I know I predicted snow, but as a matter of fact, the barometric pressure changed, and then the system came in, and yeah, and it was sunny and warm, but you know, you win some, you lose some. No. So you learn, and I learned early on, one of my first big gaffes was to make a big introduction about a beautiful piece of Beethoven, and I pushed play, and out came a Scott Joplin rag. So at the end of that broadcast, that piece, I came back on the air and I very calmly introduced it as what it was, the Joplin rag. And I added a little historic vignette, you know, so it seemed like it was meant to be. So those were valuable little lessons. Anyway, that's how I got my start. 10 years on Coho, K-O-H-O radio, which then led nicely. I had my radio legs by then to my position at King FM, which began in 2011.
Okay. Right.
So, and Harriet's advice was right. Just be yourself.
I wholeheartedly agree. I have to say, when you first started at King FM, I remember hearing you on the radio, driving to a rehearsal, and you were introducing Scriabin's Poem of Fire. And I thought, that introduction was so fabulous. I just got to stay here and hear it. And I thought, wait, I have to go to this rehearsal. I can't do that. But you know, I really, you got me totally sucked into it. And I thought your enthusiasm, the enthusiasm in your voice translates so beautifully to radio. It makes you a fabulous radio DJ.
Gosh, well, thank you, Svend. Thank you. And then I learned a writer's trick, which is to find a nugget. So for every front announce, I have a nugget, something. Like I remember that one. I was describing the flat lands across Mongolia or something like that, and the distant yurt and the camel. And anyway, finding a nugget really does help people. A visual clue is a very powerful tool for an audio art. Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Right. Lisa, I'm guessing you aren't doing too much performing these days like most of us, but I do know that you've been part of a little industry of improvisation across the continents, or at least of collaboration across the continents. And I think this is the brainchild of a Norwegian pianist named Inger-Kristine Riber, and
who, by the way, excuse me, Svend, has performed at PLU.
Has she indeed? Wow.
Yeah. Several times. Anyway, wow. Just want to interject that.
Cool. And so she has kind of like created this opportunity for to stay in touch with her friends across the world in the time of the pandemic by doing chamber music across the airwaves based on a composition by Nils Henrik Asheim, I think.
Correct. She called this Alone Together. And the way she crafted this was really ingenious. Typically, two pianists would play the duet version the way this is printed. There's a primo and a secondo, and the four hands play at once, live on stage, together. Well, that's not possible during the pandemic. So what she did instead was to invite a different pianist on 5 different continents to to play with her. So she was the link between all the other 5. So one was in Korea, one was in Spain, one was in South Africa, Italy, and I in Seattle. And what we did was to record our solo performance of this duet at a certain tempo, and then upload it. And then she was able to fit in playing the other part at her piano in Oslo. So she was really accompanying us, if you can think of it that way. And it was fascinating because it's a legitimate piece of music played by all these different people with her as the ringleader at her piano. And she's very clever at it. So I don't know if anyone's done anything quite like it. So the variation that I was asked to do is a very jazzy one, and it's on this theme, Mikkel Rev. It's a little children's song from Norway about Michael the fox who is so surprised that he by something that he jumps up into his daddy's top hat. I mean, it's just a children's song. It's a cute little tune. Da 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 da, and so on.
Right. Sure.
But you'd never recognize it when you hear these variations.
Sure, of course. Yeah, the simpler the tune, the better for theme and variations, right?
Right.
I dag det påskeaften, og jeg har en liten overraskelse. Jeg har kontaktet pianister rundt hele verden, og vi skal I dag framføre et variasjonsverk over Mikkel Rev. Det ikke plass til at alle skal få lov å snakke på telefon I denne episoden, så vi går rett på musikken. God fornøyelse.
So Lisa, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in music and what made you pursue the piano, and what kind of advice would you have for any aspiring pianists out there?
Well, I'm an only child, and classical music was always a part of our daily life. This was in West Seattle, Washington. And that in part was fueled by my mother, who was a very good amateur pianist. And when I was about 6, my father bought her a grand, and it was delivered from Sherman Clay, downtown Seattle, with a big red ribbon around it. And the 3 of us stood there in the living room and cried with joy. So my mother would often sit down just because she wanted to, because she loved music, which then led to my father becoming an adult beginner of the cello. Well, it wasn't long before he needed an accompanist, and I, in the meantime, had begun taking piano lessons from a local teacher who lived just down the beach. This was on the beach in West Seattle, and I would walk on the clam bed to my lessons. And after a while, Dad said, "How about it? Would you accompany me?" And I thought, okay, I'd never thought of that, 2 at once and all that. And I learned some skills that are critical for all chamber musicians, and particularly accompanists, on how to compensate for someone else's, shall we say, inadequacies. And in his case, he sometimes would add a beat or subtract a beat. And I knew that if I stopped the whole works to correct him, it would take forever. So I learned how, on the fly, to make the corrections that would keep the ship afloat. And I use those skills, still do, in concert and in rehearsal. It makes life a whole lot simpler.
Sounds like you've been doing chamber music from the nursery, Lisa.
It's just about. So I thank my dad millions of times for those early lessons. But what I would strongly encourage, in fact, I have a book. I'm just going to go ahead and make an ad out of this. It's called Career Opportunities in the Music Industry, a comprehensive guide to exciting careers in music or music-related fields, and nearly 100 specific jobs. This is a way to parlay one's training as a classical musician, and pop musicians too are included in this category, where you can find very gratifying careers that you would never be able to enter into without your skills as a musician first. And I do a lot of lecturing on this very topic, because lots of young musicians, let's say in high school, especially the more advanced ones, have their eyes set on a faculty position or the concert stage. Given the events and the surplus of beautifully trained musicians on the face of this earth, those careers are less and less likely. What is more likely is finding a new niche. And that's exactly what I would recommend. There are so many niches out there of music-related jobs in the industry, and it is an industry.
Great. Yeah, you've done a lot of them. So.
Thank you. I walk the talk, actually. Yeah.
That's true. Great. Well, Lisa, tack så mycket for speaking with us. As always, we're looking forward to the next time that you can join us on the Second City Chamber Series. Until then.
Ja, tack så mycket. Hej så länge.
Hej så länge.